Hello and welcome to Realpolitik, a podcast where we tackle pressing issues in global affairs by proposing policy solutions to the governments of Canada and the United States. In this month's episode of Realpolitik, I had the pleasure of speaking with John Gilbert about the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and the past, present, and future of arms control policy in the US and Canada. His policy-relevant experience goes back many years and is an inspiration to many in the field. This episode hoped to serve as an introduction to any analyst looking to gather more knowledge on what is happening in the nonproliferation policy world. Our intended goal is to propose policy solutions to governments of Canada, the United States, and beyond. Here's our conversation. He started by elaborating on his career path.
I started my military service back in the 1960s, early 70s. Initially, I spent time working with a long-range strategic missile system in a U.S. ICBM base in Kansas. After doing that for a number of years, I changed what career path I was on in the military. I spent the next 15 years working in the intelligence world, trying to manage programs to understand what other countries' WMD capabilities were. Because of that, late in my active duty career, I had an opportunity to become one of the first US inspectors operating in the Soviet Union under the INF Treaty. Over a period of years, I conducted over 30 inspections in the former Soviet Union, and also acted as a host, minder, or escort for Soviet teams that came to the US. After doing that for a few years, I was asked to step in, and after getting promoted, step in as chief of the Chemical and Biological Inspection Division for the U.S. On-Site Inspection Agency. During that period of time, I was part of the U.S. negotiating delegation for the Chemical Weapons Convention in Geneva and The Hague, and also was on the negotiating team for a bilateral chemical weapon agreement with the then Soviet Union, meeting in Moscow and Geneva. Eventually, it became time for me to retire, and I went into the private sector, working for a technical services firm where I worked on and managed a number of contracts that had to do with WMD. A lot of that time was spent on chemical weapon issues, mostly training people in the process of conducting and managing an inspection. As part of that, I also helped select and train some people who inspected in Iraq after the first Gulf War and before the second one. And I think most importantly, talked about them later after their experiences in that country. And recently started to teach a course to young career professionals who are working in nonproliferation, both for government agencies and in academia. As part of that, I developed an affiliation with the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation in Washington, D.C., and still have been working with them mostly on chemical weapon and operational weapon issues. It was a lot more interesting than I ever thought it would be.
Right. We then spoke about defining WMD and their specific characteristics.
And I guess a good starting point would be a question that I'm sure you had to grapple with when you were starting out on nonproliferation issues, which is, how would you define WMD? And what makes them different from conventional weapons that we're used to?
Okay. Well, I think, as you said, a good starting point is to come up with a working definition. A mass destruction weapon I would characterize as one whose effects extends significantly beyond the point of impact or release. And there are a couple of other things, though, that distinguish WMD from what are considered conventional weapons. Of course, one area is how widespread the weapon effect is. And just as an example, back in 2013, August of 2013, by the way, a small number of nerve agent rockets were launched into a neighborhood in a Damascus suburb. Over an area of several city blocks, between 1,300 and 1,500 people were killed almost instantly. That's a clear example of something that had an effect way beyond the impact point of those individual rockets. Another thing is the physics and chemistry of weaponry differs. For example, conventional weapons are generally considered to be kinetic weapons, energetic weapons, like bullets, or chemically explosive, like a bomb, an artillery shell, or a landmine. And WMD rely on other physical, chemical, and biological processes to have an effect.
And is there a kind of agreement on those definitions, or is there a lot of debate on it?
One thing that I would say is if you mention a particular type weapon, people are going to know whether they consider it a WMD or not, in most cases. But yeah, the terminology differs. And let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, I was able to have a very personal discussion with a Soviet emigre who would work in the Soviet biological weapon program. And we were talking about this. And he kind of was confused when I talked about mass destruction weapons. He said, well, in the Soviet Union, we call them weapons of mass casualty. Now, think about that difference in worldview. Destruction versus casualties. And that reflects a very different mindset and worldview, and could lead to a difference in how people view the categorization of various weapons.
Has there been a debate on how much those weapons and the physical nature of it has changed since World War II and even beyond that in the last decades?
One of the things that I would call a major trend is that over the period since World War II, and I know that's been many decades, mass destruction weapons have become much more sophisticated, more commonly diverse, more destructive, and more deadly. For example, the two weapons used against Japan in August of 1945 had yields of approximately 17 to 21 kilotons or 1,000 tons of TNT. Current nuclear weapons have yields from several hundred kilotons up to multiple megatons or millions of tons of TNT. That's a huge advance in the destructive power of nuclear weapons. Another thing that is new is the concept of radiological weapons has been talked about. And what a radiological weapon is a weapon that relies on the dispersal of radioactive material, not a nuclear explosion, but another type of explosion or other activity that would distribute nuclear material over a wide area. You'll think, for example, Fukushima over a period, an area of a couple city blocks. That would be extremely disruptive, but as far as is known publicly, no state has pursued radiological weapons. But a lot of non-state entities have considered them as aspirational. And for a variety of reasons, which maybe we can talk about a little later, they haven't succeeded yet.
Next was our conversation about the history and state of chemical and biological weapons, talking about the Japanese cult and terrorist group LF, referred to here as Amshinrikyo.
Today, the chemical weapons that have been used most frequently have been nerve agents of types that were synthesized after World War II. World War II did see the production of large quantities of some nerve agents, such as sarin, and also various mustard agents that cause massive blisters. Those weren't used in World War II for a variety of reasons, but because of doubts over their military effectiveness, countries looked farther into chemistry and developed more toxic nerve agents with different properties. Biological weapon technology was really pretty primitive during World War II. And one particular program that some people may be aware of is a program to infect fleas and mosquitoes with plague and malaria, and then release those in a populated area, hoping to make people sick. It didn't work. It was tried, but it didn't work. So later states converged on what I call a preferred set of agents, one of which is anthrax. And anthrax was in fact used by a non-state entity in the US right after the 2001 airplane attacks. And it caused several deaths and over 20 serious illnesses. Another thing that's probably less well known is that the Amshinrikyo doomsday cult in Japan also pursued weaponizing anthrax, but they weren't able to make anybody sick. They made a big mistake, and it just didn't work.
States possessing WMD and the process to becoming WMD states were then discussed in detail. You mentioned controversial cases like Syria, Iran, North Korea, and Israel.
And I know that this will vary upon the nature of the weapons, but who is in possession of those weapons? So you mentioned state and non-state actors.
Right now, there are 5 what are called declared nuclear weapon possessing states. And the mechanism for their being declared nuclear weapon states is found in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, or NPT. The 5 states are now Russia, China, United Kingdom, France, and the United States. Other countries have tested nuclear weapons, but they are not declared nuclear weapon states because they're outside the NPT. I'm talking there about India, Pakistan, and North Korea. Looking back, though, several years, South Africa also produced a small number of nuclear weapons, and for a variety of reasons, dismantled them and destroyed part of their infrastructure back in the 1990s. Again, with respect to nuclear weapons, Iraq tried but failed. And more recently, it's widely thought that Syria made an attempt at weapon development, but that was aborted in 2007. And it doesn't look like Syria has made any progress since. And that kind of brings us to 2 other states, one of which is Iran. And I hope we get a chance to talk about that a little later. Iran very likely pursued a nuclear weapon program, but there's a lot of information that indicates that that program stopped in 2003. And people say, well, why did the program stop in 2003? That was because they got caught. Defectors and emigres provided information, and the intelligence services were able to come up with releasable public information that outed Iran's aspirations. And after that, it appears that they ceased a lot of their active pursuit of nuclear weapons, although they continue to build up their infrastructure. And of course, Israel's nuclear weapon status is ambiguous. And if you want to consider, say, chemical weapons, right now there's only one state that still possesses chemical weapons. That's the United States. They're in the process of destroying the last 1 or 2% of the pre-existing stockpile. But over time, probably as many as 10 countries had active stockpiles. And it's widely believed the number's much lower than that now. And a small number of countries develop biological weapons. It's probably in single digits, and the programs are not particularly active and not particularly massive, with one possible exception.
The exception would be Russia, I'm guessing.
Yes, and there's ambiguity there too.
Right. And part of why there's so few countries that have those weapons is how difficult, especially nuclear weapons, is the difficulty of making those weapons. You require certain conditions and resources and manpower to make them. So how easy is it exactly, or how difficult is it to make those weapons?
I could teach a whole course on that. Development of an effective nuclear weapon requires just an absolutely enormous investment in a number of areas. It requires intellectual effort, the knowledge base. It requires technology, not just the technology of how to assemble a weapon, but how to find and go through the whole process of creating the material needed to produce a nuclear explosive yield. Also, that requires a massive, massive industrial capability and a lot of financial resources. And there are some other things too. One of the things that I learned years ago was that in the 1950s, when the United States was actively building its nuclear weapon arsenal, approximately 10% of all the electricity produced in the United States went into the process of producing uranium and plutonium for weapons. That's a huge investment. And a lot of countries have not been able to combine all of those resources in a way that they could effectively produce a weapon. And of course, some have tried and got caught. With chemical weapons, so it's a different story. Effective chemical weapons can be produced in a laboratory environment. And the amount produced would be small, but it could be effectively used, for example, as we've seen for individual assassinations. But any large-scale production of chemical weapons requires, again, a large industrial infrastructure, as well as a transportation infrastructure and the ability to safely store chemical weapons, many of which have a tendency to leak and be more dangerous to the people that built them than to their potential targets. Now, I do have to say that the evidence is pretty strong that a couple of terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda and Shinrikyo, have either stolen chemical weapons agent, the actual chemicals, or produce small quantities on their own. And also ISIS, or what some people call Daesh, co-opted an academic infrastructure in Iraq and compelled the staff there to produce chemical material for ISIS use against civilian populations. And they, I think they pretty successfully made some mustard, which was used with limited effect, but was probably more psychological than anything else. And biological weapons, it's even tougher to make an effective biological weapon, especially one that works to make people sick and do anything more than terrorize the population. Like I said earlier, several countries did have active BW programs, but after the Biological Weapons Convention went into effect, most of those shut themselves down. But non-state groups have tried. I mentioned Aum Shinrikyo. There was also another religious cult in the US that came up with a brilliant idea to try to interfere with an election by spraying E. coli bacteria on a salad bar, hoping that all of the non-cult voters in that county would get sick and not be able to show up and vote. Whereas all the cultists were registered voters, so they thought they would outvote it, change the name of the county, and elect their own county officials and sheriff. It didn't work. And of course, there was the 2001 anthrax letter series of attacks in the US that was actually pretty well done. I can talk in a little detail maybe about why that succeeded and what it took to make it succeed. Radiological weapons, I mentioned earlier. In order to do that, you have to have access to fissionable material. Spent reactor fuel would be one source, but it's usually well protected. Medical isotopes are usually less well protected, and there have been cases where some have been stolen. In fact, some have even been stolen accidentally when a UPS truck was hijacked. And in fact, the perpetrators ended up getting radiation poisoning incidentally to the theft. It's possible, but you still have to be able to assemble it, create a dispersal means like a bomb, and find a really optimum place to use it. And not getting caught is tough. If any radioactive material is determined to be missing, there will be a determined search for it. And it's hard to hide radioactive material.
I then inquired about the different methods pursued to transport and use weapons of mass destruction and how they can backfire.
You mentioned dispersal means. What are the kinds of dispersal means and transportation mechanisms that one could use to use those weapons?
Do you mean a radiological weapon or some of the others?
WMD in general. So I wrote down submarines, launchers, ICBMs, airdrops,
okay.
bombs.
Current nuclear weapons rely on large hardware. Ground-based missiles, for example, that anywhere from short range to intercontinental and even worldwide range. They're large, they're easily observed compared to some other things. Aircraft have been configured to deliver nuclear weapons, and submarines by launching missiles, either cruise missiles or ballistic. In the years after World War II, there were some other means of nuclear weapon delivery that were a lot less hardware intensive, but they've been withdrawn from service. For example, artillery shells with a nuclear warhead were tested and possibly deployed. There were what are called backpack bombs that were developed for use by special operations forces. And nuclear landmines were developed that could be either contact detonated or remotely detonated. And even a weapon that was called the Davy Crockett, which was essentially a large bazooka that fired a very small nuclear warhead a couple of miles. Now, all of those have some problems. They don't have great range. So if their yield is maybe a little bit greater than intended, it's going to be pretty bad for the people that initiated their use. Plus the fact that they were small and they were dispersed, which made them subject to theft or misuse by the people that were supposed to be taking care of them. So they were withdrawn for a combination of doubts over effectiveness and security. And that makes nuclear weapons a lot more predictable today than they were. Chemical weapons, though, had a variety of means of delivery. There are artillery shells, aircraft bombs, several types were developed by different countries. Spray tanks that were mounted under aircraft wings were developed and tested. There are even mortar shells and landmines with chemical fill that were used. And of course, mass release from a bulk container, like a chlorine or phosgene container that could be set up, wait for the wind to blow the right direction, open the valve, and hope that you poison somebody downwind instead of yourself. As of right now, though, about 98%, a little over 98% of the declared world stockpile of chemical weapons have been dismantled and destroyed under the Chemical Weapon Convention. But there's some recent, very conclusive hard evidence that Syria has continued to produce and store chemical weapon material, probably in the form of agent, not necessarily put into a bomb. And that's a problem. And you have talked about chemical weapon uses. There have been some what I'd call limited successes, but small scale. Aum Shinrikyo did successfully conduct a multiple release point sarin attack against the Tokyo subway system in 1995. And about 10 people were killed very quickly as a result of that. Some may have died since. But most recently, chemical weapons have been used for individual assassination attempts. A lot of people have probably seen the video from the Kuala Lumpur airport where a binary form of the nerve agent VX was applied to Kim Jong-il's half-brother who died. The Soviets, and I think the evidence is conclusive on this, Soviets attempted to assassinate a Russian defector and his daughter, and they actually killed an innocent civilian using the nerve agent Novichok, which was uniquely developed by the Soviet Union. They used Novichok again last August. A lot of things happened in August to attempt to kill Alexei Navalny. And there may have been a similar attempt on his life. Looking back even farther, a Russian emigre was poisoned in London by polonium. And the evidence trail leads to two Russian, it wasn't called the KGB then, but they probably were in the KGB at one time. And even back in late 70s, a Bulgarian dissident journalist was killed in London using the toxin ricin that was injected in a really creative way. and he died within probably about 2 or 3 days. Fortunately, an extensive autopsy was able to reconstruct what happened. And biological weapons have not been widely used, but they've generally been distributed in small scale ways. You know, the anthrax letters, spraying E. coli from a perfume sprayer on a salad bar, and using an insect fogger to disperse anthrax spores. They've been tried with varying degrees of success.
And for the Bulgarian dissident who or journalist who was killed in London through ricin, what was the method of dispersion? What was the creative method?
Okay, the people who did it created a very small metal pellet, BB-sized metal pellet, drilled 2 holes in it, filled those holes with ricin, and then put wax over the holes to seal them. But with body heat and moisture, the wax dissolved, released the ricin into his bloodstream. It was injected probably by a spring-loaded tip of an umbrella. And the umbrella was carried by someone who had surveilled the journalist. And as he was walking across the Waterloo Bridge in London, walked up to him, stabbed him with the tip of the umbrella, and a couple days later, it became fatal.
That is quite creative indeed.
Yes.
And you mentioned unintended consequences of the use of these weapons, particularly chemical and biological and radiological agents. Is that a kind of deterrent for their use, or not in the way that other deterrents, such as the mutually assured destruction doctrine, would be?
Well, I think the uncertainty over the effect of chemical and biological weapons, and probably radiological, a lot depends on what happens after they're released. You know, even a simple thing like if the umbrella carrier had missed by half an inch, that wouldn't have worked. Anthrax letters had followed a different path and had not released spores in massive amounts, it probably would have been ineffective. And killing innocent people who found the residue of the Novichok attack weapon in Salisbury, UK, that's not good publicity. Plus the unpredicted fact that when Navalny was intoxicated with Novichok, the airplane was diverted, and a doctor in the facility where he was treated recognized the symptoms and treated him with an effective antidote before the security services could intervene. So there's a lot of inability to predict. You know, even simple things like getting caught on film, wiping VX components on someone's face, that's unpredictable. And they had to have gotten lucky to be able to do it and do it twice. So, yeah, I think there is a degree of deterrence that arises from the uncertainty over what happens after a weapon is set in motion. The same thing with a radiological weapon. If the wind had been blowing differently at Fukushima or at Chernobyl, there might have been very different outcomes. Same with a biologic or a radiological weapon that was detonated in Times Square.
John and I then spoke about state and non-state actors looking to acquire their nuclear weapon capabilities, arms control policy, and deterrence.
It makes it a lot more complicated and expensive to do it. They may feel they need to bring in a larger group to get more, to get more resources into planning out and carrying out an attack, and that runs the risk of detection. So I think the uncertainty is something that will act as a deterrent, but it won't be an absolute deterrent. We know that.
It'll be good containment, but not suppression.
I think that's a good way to say it. I wish I had thought of that.
And we spoke about countries that do have weapons of mass destruction. What about those that are looking to acquire it? So, for example, Iran. Are there other, or you could even talk about Iran? Are there entities looking to acquire them and actively use them, or is that a thing of the past?
I don't think we can ever say something is totally ended. Clearly, North Korea is looking to greatly expand its nuclear weapon capabilities. They've made public statements. They've tested. There has been an expansion of activities at one of their facilities that produces the material for weapons at a constant but slow pace. And public statements by the North Korean leadership have indicated that they still have a fundamental national commitment to building up their nuclear force, both technologically and in terms of numbers.
And what about non-state actors? So, for example, terrorist and insurgent groups. They've been increasingly important now in world affairs. Have any of these groups tried recently? So you mentioned ISIS. Tried to acquire these weapons, and have they used them in a significant way?
Well, yeah, I think the evidence is pretty clear that ISIS did actively pursue chemical weapons and used them on a small scale. ISIS is having trouble surviving right now because of international military pressure. But if that pressure is relieved, they might consider that a path they want to re-engage in. As far as other groups, none of the terrorist groups outside the Middle East appear to have been actively pursuing chemical or biological weapons. And I'm pretty sure that their goals don't depend upon that. Most of them are national liberation movements that are more political than fundamentalist. And that gives them a different worldview.
And given that we don't exactly have diplomatic relations with ISIS and other terrorist groups, how do we make sure that they abide by the treaties that are recognized by most international bodies and nations? Because we couldn't exactly bring them into NPT, for example.
If ISIS tries to build up a nuclear weapon infrastructure, I think somebody's going to notice. And they'll notice in time to do something about it. But non-state entities are resistant to international pressure in most cases. They feel that their way is the way in a very fundamentalist worldview. They don't feel bound by international agreements that somebody whose existence they object to signed up for. The government of Syria signed the Chemical Weapon Convention. ISIS really doesn't feel that they're going to be bound by anything they do. And in fact, the Syrian chemical weapon discovered recently, that weapon stash, was not under the control of ISIS. So I think right now, ISIS is probably in hiatus with respect to chemical and biological weapons. There have been aspirational things that have been out there in the public domain for a number of years, but for a variety of reasons, they just have not succeeded. And as I said earlier, it really does take a commitment of intellect and technology and money and the ability to operate in secret for long enough to do what you need to do. And right now, ISIS and Al Qaeda are not being able to do that. But something to think about, though, India and Pakistan, they both have tested weapons. I think the international consensus is that they each have a supply of deliverable weapons. And my assumption here is that India and Pakistan most likely view their WMD programs as deterrence against each other, or possibly deter China from taking extreme actions against either country. There have been Indian-Chinese shooting conflicts on the border for the last year, with fatalities on both sides. India might be thinking about that and whether or not nuclear weapons could be a deterrent. Iran is a different case. As I said earlier, I think there is a lot of information that they were, to some degree, pursuing a weapons program in the early 2000s. That stopped, and then the 2015 agreement, once implemented, effectively cut off both the uranium and plutonium paths to a weapon for the duration of the agreement. A lot of people don't realize that the agreement itself is permanent, but some of its provisions are due to expire or be less intrusive from an inspection viewpoint over time. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that later on. But something to worry about here is, given the current situation with respect to Iran, they may feel that the time is right for them to back out of the deal completely. They're not benefiting from sanctions relief. Their economy really hasn't collapsed. The coronavirus has probably done as much damage to their society and economy as the sanctions have over the last year. And the new president, Ibrahim Raisi, has indicated that Iran's future does not necessarily lie within the framework of that agreement. I haven't seen an exact quote, but there have been several reports that he is skeptical about Iran's continuation with what minimal things they're complying with right now.
We then look to the future of non-military use of nuclear energy in the United States and on a global scale to fight climate change.
Given the fact that the U.S. is slowly but surely giving up its nuclear arsenal, very, very slowly but surely as well, will nuclear power in the U.S. be mainly used for commerce and energy supply and technology as opposed to military capability?
In the U.S., nuclear power is considered a third rail. I believe there is only one nuclear power plant under construction in the United States right now. That's in the state of Georgia. It's well over budget and well over planned construction time. The second active power reactor program was in South Carolina, and it met its demise in 2019 when one of the major suppliers declared bankruptcy. People looked at what was left of the program and realized that was even more bankrupt than the equipment supplier was. So right now, there are, I believe, 2 reactors that are being built. Some are being thought about, but none are at the stage of licensing or even close to construction. And I don't see the U.S. being prominent in the international nuclear power marketplace, even though nuclear power makes up well over 10% of all the electricity the U.S. generates. Now, on the other hand, Canada has come up with some very, very promising areas of nuclear power technology, one of which is particularly useful to counter possible proliferation. A Canadian technology was produced using what's called mixed oxide fuel, where uranium and plutonium oxides, or powders, are mixed together in a subcritical mass but still produce enough heat to generate nuclear power. What this does is it takes uranium and plutonium that could previously have gone into a weapon and turns it into a reactor fuel without having to start with natural uranium and enrich it to be concentrated enough to produce enough heat, but rather to take the previously produced highly enriched uranium and plutonium and use them to burn in a reactor. And Canada also has come up with designs for small modular generating units. Instead of millions of megawatts, they're talking about thousands of kilowatts. So the infrastructure required to produce those has much less of a footprint, much less of a cost, and might be more amenable to the local population accepting them than something the size of Plant Vogtle in Georgia, which is the plant itself is the size of a small city. Now, one thing too, it's important here, nuclear power reactors by themselves are not a major risk for proliferation. The fuel they use is, enriched to less than 5% in most cases. And it's hard to take spent nuclear fuel, divert it, re-enrich it to try to get to a weapon grade level. And most nuclear power reactors are not designed in a way to optimize the creation of plutonium. A reactor that creates plutonium has a very different design and energetic materials that are used. So nuclear power reactors tend to be a way to get uranium out of the weapon cycle and into generating nuclear power. And that's how Iran actually started their program, was with the idea of generating nuclear power. And at the same time, some people suspected that they were going to divert some of their basic uranium supply into a weapon program. And even that changed. Even before the JCPOA, Iran agreed to stop making its own fuel for the reactors at Bushehr and instead to buy it from Russia and to send the spent fuel back to Russia, their own reprocessing. So that took it out of the proliferation cycle there. So I know that's a real long answer to a well-focused question.
I do appreciate your answer. And I think it's very important to discuss because there's a very different debate in each country regarding. So, for example, Germany, there was a big controversy around Merkel a couple of weeks ago because she took policy steps away from nuclear power as a commercial and self-sufficient energy source. And it's a very important debate because a lot of the technology that we would like to use, which currently relies on fossil fuels, would need to be veered away from that towards nuclear energy, but we're simply not willing to make that transition yet, at least not in the Western world. And so where do you see that debate headed? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about it?
Both. I think that over time, people may realize that the risk they perceive from nuclear power generation can be overcome by proper design and operation, and accidents prevented or minimized. At the same time, given the release this week of the UN report on accelerated climate change, that's going to cause some people in a lot of countries to stop and take a look at what their future holds in a carbon-based economy. Nuclear power is not carbon-free because a lot of carbon goes into the energy needed from the beginning, from finding and mining uranium ore through the whole process of making a reactor fuel on an ongoing basis to keep the reactors going. Plus, a lot of carbon is expended in the manufacturing process, transporting all of the material needed to build the plants, and for the workers building the plants to drive to and from the site every day. So right now, it's a way for the future, perhaps to transition away from a lot of carbon-based energy creation to something that's less carbon-based. And things like using modular generating units might be a good solution.
The ongoing investigation and disinformation war regarding the origins of COVID-19 and biological weapons were then brought up.
And continuing on current affairs, do you see a correlation between the COVID-19 pandemic and a renewed or increased concern for biological weapons?
Uh, yes, I do. I think my concern here is there is a lot of speculation about whether or not the coronavirus itself was created as a biological weapon. That's still under investigation. A lot of people who are familiar with that and know a lot more about it than I do feel very strongly that its most likely origin was natural, that evolved in an animal and jumped to humans, which has happened a lot in China. But the fact that there is suspicion that this was created as a biological weapon, I think is going to resonate with some, and that's not just arising in the West. Once again, China has come out with a statement to the effect that, well, COVID really was a biologic weapon produced by the United States Army, and they released it in China. There's a lot of misinformation and a lot of myths and cult theories going on about this. But I think it ought to raise concern more broadly than just biological weapon. A biological weapon on the scale of coronavirus has never been imagined before. And it does have it creates an emotional response for a lot of people to think about that. But practically, if you look at biological weapon development, they just haven't gotten there where there was a pandemic. And one of the things that I think tends to show that, if you look back at the anthrax letters in the United States, whoever did that, the perpetrator or perpetrators who were involved, had access to a highly virulent strain of anthrax. They were able to divert it from wherever it had been held under secure means. They were able to refine and process it into an incredibly dispersive material form. They packaged it very cleverly, and they mailed it to targets designed to evoke publicity. There were consequential deaths and illnesses because of the fact that the envelopes leaked anthrax spores en route. And that's where most of the deaths occurred. There was one death among a recipient of one of the letters, and there were two deaths who were probably downwind from the mailbox where the letters were deposited, one in New York and one in Connecticut. And it's believed the letters were deposited in a collection box in New Jersey. And that is a criminal case that is actually still unsolved. There have been several persons of interest named over the years, one of whom committed suicide. So, there's a lot we don't know about that. But again, that shows even a very, very well conducted BW attack had limited casualties. It did cause a lot of economic disruption and mail disruption for months. Offices everywhere were coming up with plans for how to deal with anthrax in their mailroom or their restroom. And in fact, at that time, the organization I worked for had a very large contract with the US government to detect and mitigate against a follow-on anthrax attack. We didn't spend all the money, but it did point out the disruptive and economic cost of a small scale but well-conducted BW attack. And I think one of the things that the audience might want to think about is, how do we recognize a BW attack early enough to do something about it, distinguish it from a natural outbreak, And if it's a directed attack, how do we respond? I use an older example. Back in the 1970s, a number of people attending a convention all came down with a rare form of pneumonia within hours of each other. They all attended an American Legion conference in the Northeast. They all became sick. A lot of people died. The death rate from that small outbreak was in double-digit percentages, much higher even than COVID has been so far. But because the symptoms all occurred in a known group over a limited period of time, contact tracing and environmental detection were able to figure out it was contaminated industrial water in a cooling tower that was the reservoir for that pneumonia. It's called Legionnaire's disease, and there have been several other outbreaks since then, but they have all been able to be detected and localized quickly because the DNA fingerprint for Legionella bacteria is well known. On the other hand, if the onset of that disease had been, say, instead of 1 to 2 or 3 days, had been 4, 5, or 6 days, it'd be a completely different story. Everybody would have gone home. They would have become sick and gone to see separate doctors. That cluster would have been much, much harder to recognize, and it would have taken much, much longer to do the necessary contact tracing, backtracking, and detective work. Extrapolating that to a BW attack tends to show the unpredictability. If a BW attack creates symptoms rather quickly, as the anthrax letters appear to have done, it's relatively easier to recognize and take countermeasures. Figuring out who's behind it is a different story.
And could this be a sort of diamond in the rough situation where the alarmism amongst the population is enough to help governments make those countermeasures and sign on to treaties and get more involved on these issues, BW issues?
We're seeing right now in the United States a really destructive reaction among the population and the governments of various states and local governments. Deliberate misinformation is all over the place. Fear is in a lot of places, but people don't always fear the disease. What we're seeing is that people are more afraid of wearing a mask or getting a vaccination than they are of getting sick and dying. That dichotomy does not drive the focus of the population's energy and fear in any one direction. If anything, it sends it off in two different directions. Even if this were a biological weapon attack, I think the reaction after the attack would probably be similar. So I'm not optimistic that people have learned a productive lesson from previous BW attacks or from the coronavirus pandemic.
So should we be concerned at all about China's WMD arsenal development, or is it similar to the United States and Russia where they are disposing of it?
China has had nuclear weapons likely for many decades. They first conducted a successful nuclear test in the 1960s. Their program has advanced since then. A couple things have happened that I think are reason for significant concern. Last fall, China showed what they called were a new family of strategic weapons. They showed what they said were hypersonic glide weapons mounted on the front of mobile missiles. A hypersonic glide vehicle is very difficult to intercept, and it may be very difficult to detect because of its velocity. A cruise missile flies at the speed of an airplane, or maybe even slower to save fuel and extend range. But a hypersonic glide vehicle that was launched by a ballistic type missile already has all the energy it needs to get to its target. It can fly faster and it can move. What they showed was something that looked like it could, it had aerodynamic fins that could probably be rotated to cause it to veer off from an apparent target and strike something many miles away just a few seconds later. So that's a very worrisome weapon. Whether it works or not, we don't know. China has also said that they're developing different types of hypersonic vehicles, some of which could be dropped from airplanes. So they're looking at a technology that they think gives them an edge over the defensive ability of people they would launch against. And something else that's come out this summer, and it's August again, it appears that the Chinese are in the process of building over 200 silos that could be used to house long-range missiles. The construction started, several months ago. It's not complete, but there's enough visible on commercial satellite imagery to project two different geographically separated fields, each of which have over 100 likely silo sites. That's a major expansion of launchers if they put a missile in each one. And China hasn't talked much about that. And it looks like they're taking expensive precautions so that commercial imagery can't produce technical information people could use to figure out things like how big the missile is going to be, or whether every silo is going to be designed to actually hold a missile, or whether they're going to put 10 or 20 missiles in 100 holes so that we don't know where they are. And if we want to wipe them out, we have to try to hit 100 instead of the right 10. They might be playing a shell game. So there's a lot going on that raises concern. Another area is that China has very aggressively built military facilities, including airfields and ports, on islands that they have either expanded in the South and East China Seas or have built from subsurface seamounts and that are now fully operational airfields. For the first time, that could give China the ability to base WMD launching hardware outside their own country and well within reach of the Philippines, possibly even Australia and New Zealand, if they have enough long-range aircraft, or put longer-range missiles on those islands. So yes, I think there's significant cause for concern over China.
Going back to John Gilbert's career, we spoke about his experience as a WMD inspector in the former Soviet Union and Iran.
So could you tell me more about your experience with the INF Treaty and what that taught you about inspection and how effective you think it is?
I am absolutely convinced that the INF inspections that were conducted were effective. What that means is they produced valid, useful data that was essential to judging each country's compliance. Other things went into compliance judgments, but on-site inspections were the critical piece that made it work for both countries. There are a couple of reasons for that. The treaty itself had very clear inspection provisions, what inspectors were allowed to do, where, and under what circumstances. On the US side, the inspectors really knew their responsibilities. We did a lot of training, and everybody that I worked with a couple of minor exceptions, approached the job with an investigator's mindset. In other words, they were serious about doing the job. They didn't view themselves as tourists, and we didn't tour like tourists. Our local counterparts and those from Moscow also knew the rules pretty well. I think they knew the rules better than, in some cases, they knew the facility where they said they worked. That was an interesting thing for us to think about. But overall, I think both the US and then Soviet governments, through the inspection process, came away with a real clear picture of what was and was not present or happening at particular facilities under particular circumstances. And that was extremely valuable. However, there were some situations that really didn't go smoothly and quickly. And I'll tell you about a couple. And really, the fact that we had excellent interpreters helped make things succeed. Our interpreters, I thought, were very, very good. Our Soviet counterpart interpreters were good, but I don't think their level was as high as ours. And just to tell you some of the things that happened that were a little questionable, at one missile base, as as we were walking around the facility, we noticed that there was a newly constructed barbed wire fence inside the boundary of what we knew to be inspectable, official inspectable area. We could tell it was a new fence because the barbed wire hadn't rusted. And the fence posts still had little puffs of dirt around it where they had planted them. But our Moscow minders said, "Oh no," said, you can't go beyond there. That fence has always been there." And what we did was we called their attention to the fact that no, that's really a brand new fence. And if you look right over here, you can see what the old fence looks like. We pulled out a copy of the official site diagram, showed it to them. And while we were doing that, one of the local workers pulled a pair of wire cutters out of his pocket and started cutting through the fence. One of our interpreters heard him say to one of the Moscow guys, "I told you it wouldn't work." We walked through and we found items associated with missile operations that were legitimate to be where they were, but for some reason they just didn't want us to see them. And in another case, we saw a huge number of items, I'd say close to 100 items that could have been missile stages, but they're all covered with canvas. And the data declaration had said there were no INF missile stages at that base at that time. But we saw these things that, they were the right size, the right diameter, right height. They could have been missile stages. We couldn't just walk away, but they didn't want to take the canvas off. So we worked out a deal. They would individually lift the canvas partially off some of them. We'd refer to the official photographs of the missile stages, and they'd show us that what was under the canvas was not the same technically as the treaty limited stages. It took a long time to figure that out, took a long time to do it, but we went back totally confident that those were not treaty limited stages. And that was a good outcome. It did show a little bit of difference in worldview, and I will say that because this becomes important in other places. One of the things that emerged was that to a Soviet and later to a Russian, anything that's not mandatory is prohibited. To an American, anything that's not prohibited is okay if it gets the job done. So those two worldviews came into juxtaposition every day. And the outcome ended up being a balanced understanding and high confidence on the part of both countries.
We ended our conversation by discussing the JCPOA and Open Skies Treaty.
I'll talk a little bit about open skies here.
Sure, and or would you want to relate that to the JCPOA first? What you talked about, and then we can move on to Open Skies.
Okay.
Finish there.
Under the JCPOA, POA, the Iranians agreed to allow inspector presence continuously at some facilities, daily at others, and on demand anytime at yet other facilities or parts of facilities. And they even installed continuous monitoring video and nuclear data recording equipment that sent data directly to IAEA headquarters in Vienna. Those inspections worked very, very well from early 2016 when the agreement went into effect, and even for a while after May of 2018, when for not well articulated reasons, the United States administration decided to withdraw. The inspections were working very well. They continued to work well, even as Iran decided to enrich uranium beyond the percentage that they were allowed, and to produce and keep more enriched uranium than they were allowed. And they did this with inspectors present. I think they knew that the inspectors would see that, understand it, and convey it to the world, that Yes, in fact, Iran was moving away from compliance in a deliberate way. Similarly, with installing additional technical equipment called centrifuges that's essential to enrich uranium, they replaced a lot of their original generation with advanced technology centrifuges in great numbers. They weren't allowed to do that until 2024, but they started it in 2020 and told the inspectors. So they used inspectors to send their message. And prior to that, the inspectors had been able to confirm the enrichment percentage was below what was allowed. The amount of material they had on hand was less than what the max was. So that was working. There have been some problems about what are called non-declared facilities, facilities that for a variety of reasons, someone thinks could have been involved in a weapon program. Iran has not allowed effective access to those facilities. And that's a major point of contention now and probably will be going forward. But it was not part of the rationale for why the US administration chose to back out of it. So what I'd say is inspections work. They work under the Chemical Weapon Convention. They work for the nuclear, long-range nuclear treaties between the US and Soviet Union, now Russia. And they worked for the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty while that was ongoing.
So you just mentioned the U.S. withdrawal. Has that impacted the chances of the JCPOA functioning and working long term, or is there a chance for recovery?
Okay, I mixed optimism here. In my view, what we have seen in the last couple of years is that was a major mistake, and it's already had some adverse consequences. The agreement was fully implemented in May of 2018, and Iran was meeting all of its provisions, even though we hadn't yet started to push for access to non-declared sites. Since the withdrawal, the percentage of enrichment has gone way up from less than 4% to a much higher number. I don't want to say what I think it might be. And they have significantly increased the amount of enriched uranium they have. That puts them much closer to having the material needed to build a weapon. If in fact they have the intellectual capital and the technology base already in place, the limiting factor in the past was lack of enough uranium to make a bomb. If they're now getting to that point, they're a lot closer to having a usable weapon. Iran has already tested missiles that have a range that can reach Europe, and even Diego Garcia, which is a strategic military base in the Indian Ocean. The combination of a weapon and a long-range missile gives them a lot of threat leverage that they don't have with simply a dynamite charge on the head of the same missile. So yeah, I think it has increased the risk that could result from an Iranian decision to press forward for a weapon. And I don't know the extent to which they fear military action being taken against them. Now, that's already happened to some degree. And I think it's an unstable and unpredictable situation. Another thing to worry about is if Iran does proceed with a weapon, particularly if they announce they're going to, other countries are going to be under pressure to do the same. Saudi Arabia, for example, certainly might. Egypt might think about it. Some of the Gulf states even might think about trying to buy weapons. And Israel may remove some ambiguity. So it could lead to a very unstable situation that goes way beyond what I think the intent was of the administration's withdrawal decision. Their stated rationale really didn't seem to resonate. What they said was, we want to get out of this thing because it's not permanent. Well, it is permanent. It doesn't cover missiles. Well, it was never intended to. And it doesn't stop Iran from sponsoring terrorist groups, but it was never intended to. It was doing exactly what the world community had wanted it to do.
And that sort of uncertainty is that where the Open Skies Treaty is headed? Because the US and Russia just withdrew, leaving
Well,
Canada and Europe to kind of deal with that themselves.
well, okay. I think it's unfortunate. It was an unnecessary decision for the US to withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty. Now, in fact, Russia was violating explicit provisions of the treaty. They were prohibiting overflight in certain areas of Russian territory, and they were objecting and trying to interfere with the imagery that was collected being shared with all other Open Skies Treaty partners. A big selling point of the Open Skies Treaty was everybody gets to see everything. If the US flies a mission over Russia, we can sell 30 sets of photography from that mission to the other Open Skies party. And they don't have to have their own airplane to see what ours did. The same with the Russian image. But they were stonewalling, and there's probably a reason why but there's a way to deal with that. There's a consultative provision for people to meet in Vienna and talk about compliance issues. It wasn't worked aggressively, but there are things that could have been done. For example, we could have told Russia, well, the next time you want to fly an Open Skies mission over Ukraine, you can't get within 50 miles of the Donbass, where the Ukrainian forces are there, because you've got Russian troops in the Donbass. Yeah, we could arrange something like that in reciprocity. We could refuse to sell imagery to Belarus, for example, because they're bad actors. There are things we could have done to reciprocally pressure Russia and either embarrass them or realize that the cost of what they were doing was too high. Instead, the administration just said, well, what the heck? It's another arms control agreement. Let's just get rid of it. But that's what I'm saying. It was an unnecessary decision, but I think it'll have minimal consequence. The loss of imagery data probably will not be a decisive factor in any threat assessments or in a pre-crisis or crisis management situation. Open skies aircraft missions don't happen instantaneously. It takes a couple of days to move an aircraft, plan your flight route, fly it, come back and develop the film. The US has national capabilities that can do that and aren't subject to being told by the Russians that we can't do certain things. And there are also commercial imagers in orbit that can do on-demand imaging and sell it. They might not be able to do a 300-mile flight path, but they can certainly image places on request. That's how the new Chinese silos were found and recognized, was through commercial imagery, and an analytical organization asked and paid for better resolution imagery of certain places, and they got great imagery that really tells a story. And it happened within a couple of days. So the Open Skies Treaty, not necessary to get out of it, but minimal consequences. And in reality, it's dead as far as most countries are concerned. Russia has formally announced their withdrawal. It takes 6 months to actually happen, but they formally announced it. And as far as the US goes, it's a dead letter. Both US Open Skies observation aircraft have already gone to an airplane graveyard in Arizona. So I think, it was unfortunate, but I think it reflects the administration's view of any agreement that they don't like. I really appreciated the questions and all of the effort that went into that. That didn't happen overnight, and I could see a strategic direction of where he wanted to go. I wish we'd had more time, but I hope that your audience appreciates what we were able to cover.
Well, it was
And I really would like you to pass on my thanks to the researchers that put them together.
That concludes today's episode of Realpolitik. Join us next month, where we will speak to Marine Corps combat veteran and Super Cobra attack pilot Dr. Callan Hunter. It was a pleasure speaking with John Gilbert, and he is welcome to come back at any time. For those at home, thank you for joining us and supporting the show. If you have any comments, feel free to submit them by email at realpolitikpodcast1@gmail.com or to follow us on Twitter or Instagram. Thank you, and until next time.